The ice is calm enough to feel fake. A single seal is stretched out on a floe, breathing slow, letting the polar silence convince it that nothing big is hunting nearby. I used to think I understood dolphins. Then I met their apex cousin, an animal that's technically the largest dolphin on Earth, but not a bigger dolphin in any way that matters. Orcas rewrite marine ecosystems, and they force us to rethink what animal intelligence can look like when it evolves in a world made of sound. Because the water around that flow doesn't just move, it starts to organize. Not splashing, not thrashing, aligning. A few dark backs surface at a distance and then vanish, like someone switched them off. Seconds later, they reappear closer, and the geometry tightens. The ocean is suddenly full of intention, and then the flow tilts. Not because something hit it, because something hit the water. A wave climbs onto the ice like a living thing, breaks across the seal's body, and slides it toward the edge. This should not work. And yet, in a documented hunt off the west side of the Antarctic Peninsula, a group of orcas did exactly this, over and over, using coordinated passes beneath the ice to fracture it, steer it into open water, and finally wash their prey into the sea. What shakes me isn't just the violence, it's the method. In that single hunt, the whales didn't wave wash once and hope. They tested, they adjusted, they reduced the flow piece by piece, they cleared away nearby ice, they positioned themselves. 4 whales accelerated in a line abreast formation, while another held station near the flow. Then, the final wave tipped the platform and the seals slid into waiting mouths. This is not a random predator. This is a predator that behaves like it has a plan. If we're going to follow that plan, we need to understand what an orca actually is, without draining the mystery out of it. An orca is a dolphin, the largest member of the dolphin family, scaled into an apex machine, built to chase down, pin, tear, and share. Found in every ocean on Earth, orcas are among the most widely distributed cetaceans. NOAA's global estimate for the species is on the order of tens of thousands, around 50,000 individuals, while noting that population sizes are hard to pin down because different ecotypes and stocks are distributed unevenly and studied at very different intensities. That means orca is less a single population and more a worldwide umbrella for many very different ways of living. And the numbers are almost as unsettling as the behavior. NOAA lists adult lengths up to about 32 feet and weights up to roughly 11 tons, with lifespans that can stretch from decades into almost a century in some cases. And then there's the fin, the black blade that looks like it was designed to cut horizons. On a large adult male, the dorsal fin can reach around 1.8 meters, about 6 feet in height, taller than many humans, yet it's made of dense connective tissue, not bone. It's a structural flex in plain sight, huge, fast, and held upright by biology alone. Now imagine that mass moving through water like it belongs there more than you ever could. In short bursts, killer whales have been reported hitting speeds around 45 kilometers per hour, and they can cruise for long periods at much slower, energy-efficient speeds. But power is only half the story. The other half is information. Orcas are toothed whales, wired around sound. Their primary long-distance sense is hearing, and their echolocation behaves like living sonar. They emit high-frequency clicks, then read the returning echoes to estimate an object's size, shape, structure, and motion. Here's the mental image I keep coming back to. You and I walk through the world like light is truth. Orcas move through a world where light is optional and sound is reality. A focusing organ called the melon helps project sound into the water, and returning echoes become an acoustic blueprint, an invisible model built out of vibration. Then there are the teeth. Orcas carry a full set of interlocking conical teeth, often 40 to 56 total, that aren't designed to chew so much as seize and tear. Individual teeth can reach roughly 10 to 13 centimeters in length, about the length of your index finger. That's the size of a tool, not a tooth. So yes, speed, yes, muscle, yes, weaponry. But the truly unfair advantage is that orcas combine those traits with cooperation. NOAA describes them hunting with coordinated strategies, working as a team like a pack. And once you accept that the pack matters, you start noticing how orcas weaponize the environment itself. Ice becomes a lever, a shoreline becomes a trap, even silence becomes camouflage. Here's where the investigation stops being animal behavior and starts sounding like anthropology. Orcas are one species on paper, or Sinus orca, but in the real ocean, they often behave like multiple societies living under the same name. Different populations specialize on different prey and different techniques. Noah notes that what an orca eats is often driven less by what's available and more by what its community has learned, its culture. That word matters because culture means the behavior can be taught. And if it's taught, it can spread, it can vanish, it can reappear. It can fracture a population into groups that live side by side and still never truly merge. Take the eastern North Pacific, where fish-eating residents and mammal-eating bigs, transients, can share the same coastal waters and still live like strangers. A long-term study of diet and behavior found that these sympatric forms did not mix, and that their prey choices were dramatically different. Fish-focused for residents, marine mammal-focused for transients. Now add language. In the early 1990s, researchers recorded underwater calls from multiple resident pods off the coast of British Columbia and found something that should make any human ego twitch. Each pod had its own discrete call repertoire, its own dialect, and those repertoires could persist with little change for decades. This isn't just making sounds, it's identity, and identity can be inherited. A later analysis tracking call types over 12 to 13 years showed measurable dialect change over time, evidence consistent with vocal learning and cultural transmission, rather than a fixed genetic script. So now we have diet traditions and vocal traditions, both learned, and when learned behaviors shape survival, they can start shaping evolution. A major genomic study argued that ecotypes have diversified rapidly and that ecological specialization and culture can push groups apart over time, reinforcing divergence. In other words, culture doesn't just decorate the orca's life.
Culture can drive separation.
You can see the same pattern in the far south, where visually distinct Antarctic forms, type A, B, and C, differ in appearance, habitat use, and prey specialization, with evidence suggesting limited interbreeding among broadly overlapping forms. And in the last few years, that one species label has started to wobble. In 2024, a research team assembled genetic, physical, and behavioral evidence, arguing that resident and Biggs killer whales in the North Pacific are distinct enough to be considered separate species. But naming is cautious. NOAA later noted that the Society of Marine Mammalogy's Taxonomy Committee narrowly missed the threshold for full species recognition, and instead acknowledged them at least as subspecies, with species status still uncertain. Even in classification, orcas refuse to sit still, because how do you label an animal whose most powerful adaptation might be tradition? Now we go back to the hunt. Because this is where culture stops being a concept and starts becoming a weapon. Wave washing is the signature example because it looks like physics is being hacked. In one detailed observation, the whales didn't immediately dislodge the seal. They broke the flow into smaller pieces. They moved it into open water, free of escape routes. They used multiple wave passes, bubble blowing, and even physical pushing to reposition the ice. Then came the final coordinated run. 4 whales accelerating on their sides beneath the flow, producing a wave that tipped the platform and slid the seal into the water. But wave washing is only one dialect of violence. In northern Norway, herring-eating killer whales have been documented using what researchers described as a carousel method, cooperative herding that compresses a fish school into a tight ball near the surface, followed by tail slaps and coordinated feeding. In the Crozet region, intentional stranding has been described as a learned hunting method, performed by adult females and practiced, imperfectly at first, by younger whales, as if the shoreline itself were part of the curriculum. And in Patagonia, a small population is notorious for doing something that feels like a rule breaker, even among predators, deliberately beaching themselves to snatch pinnipeds in the shallows, then sliding back into the sea. These are not the same behavior, they're not the same instinct, they're localized inventions, solutions built for a specific coastline, a specific prey, a specific set of conditions. Then there's the kind of predation that makes you rethink the word apex. Between 2019 and 2021, researchers documented killer whales killing and eating blue whales in multiple events off southwestern Australia, something long debated because of the victims' size and power. And if you want a moment that feels almost too surgical to be real, look at sharks. In 2022, researchers captured direct drone footage of killer whales killing white sharks, with evidence for a tactic that includes rolling or inverting the shark toward tonic immobility before biting into the region behind the pectoral fins, consistent with earlier carcass evidence of targeted liver extraction. Afterward, local white sharks showed a flight response, a sudden prolonged absence from an area where they're normally, predictably present. This isn't just predation, it's behavioral engineering. One predator enters, another apex predator vanishes, and the whole seascape starts breathing differently. And now the question gets personal. How do you and I even begin to understand a hunt like that? Because sometimes the answer is not more noise. Sometimes it's less. Some mammal-eating groups are known to use stealth, reducing vocal activity and relying more on passive listening when hunting prey that can hear them coming. So the ocean becomes a chessboard built out of sound and silence.
At some point, you stop asking whether orcas are intelligent. Of course they are. The more haunting question is, intelligent how? The orca brain is among the largest in toothed whales. So large that researchers comparing brain mass evidence argue that big males of sperm whales and killer whales share the distinction of the largest brains among toothed whales, even though the two species live and hunt in profoundly different ways. But it's not just size, it's architecture. A detailed MRI-based neuroanatomical study reported an orca brain with an exceptionally high degree of corticalization, with the cerebrum comprising over 80% of total brain volume, placing it among the most corticalized mammalian brains studied. Translation: a tremendous amount of the orca's brain is devoted to the outer cortex, the layered surface associated across mammals with complex processing. And the hardware aligns with a life dominated by social complexity. Von Economo neurons, rare spindle-shaped projection neurons associated in humans and other large-brained mammals with high-level social cognition, have been identified in cetacean brains, underscoring that some of the neural specializations we point to in ourselves also appear in whales and dolphins. But intelligence isn't just what you can do to prey, it's what you can do with each other. In 2025, researchers reported something that honestly sounds like a myth until you see it. Wild killer whales manufacturing and using allo-grooming tools. They bite off lengths of bull kelp, shape them, wedge the kelp between their bodies, and roll together like a moving massage, a shared exfoliation, a social ritual. Tool making, not for food, but for one another. And then there's the detail that feels almost designed to haunt you. Orcas don't just have long lives. Some females have long lives after reproduction ends. A growing body of work shows that females can live for decades after their last calf, an extended post-reproductive lifespan that is rare among mammals. And those older females matter. One major study found that post-reproductive grandmothers improve grand offspring survival, especially when the grandmother is no longer reproducing herself. Another analysis links this to leadership. Older females appear to become especially important in times of scarcity, guiding their groups, suggesting that ecological knowledge can be as life-saving as strength. So when we talk about orca intelligence, we're not just talking about cleverness. We're talking about memory carried across decades, strategy carried across bloodlines, culture carried across generations, which makes the next moment harder to watch. In 2018, one southern resident female, known as J35, carried her dead calf for 17 consecutive days across roughly 1,600 kilometers. A published account evaluated the event as epimeletic behavior, placing it within a broader pattern of cetacean responses to death. And in January 2025, NOAA reported that the same whale carried another dead newborn calf again, a second tour that made the entire ocean feel suddenly smaller and far more intimate.
You can argue about whether grief is the correct word, but you can't argue about what it looks like. A mother slowing her own feeding, holding the dead at the surface, diving to retrieve the body when it sinks. For days, it's a reminder. The orca mind is not just a hunting machine. It's an emotional engine tuned for a life of tight social bonds.
Now we turn the lens back on ourselves, because the strangest part of the orca story might be what happens when culture meets a world we're rapidly reshaping. Orcas sit at the top of the marine food web, and when they shift behavior, the effects cascade. In the Aleutian Islands, scientists linked increased killer whale predation on sea otters to a chain reaction. Fewer otters meant more sea urchins, and more urchins meant kelp forests stripped down. An ecosystem altered through a single predatory pivot. In South Africa, direct observations show that killer whale predation can trigger white shark flight responses, apex predators displacing apex predators, with ripple effects that extend beyond a single kill. And in the Arctic, there's evidence that even the giants change their maps when orcas arrive. A PNAS study integrating predator and prey tracking showed bowhead whales making pronounced shifts in behavior and selecting sea ice when under perceived predation threat by killer whales, an ice refuge carved out of fear. Even the soundscape is shaped by orcas. Some small-toothed whales, like porpoises, produce narrow-band, high-frequency clicks that contain little energy below 100 kHz, a signal profile discussed as part of an acoustic arms race, where prey may lower the risk of detection by predators that hear best at lower frequencies. But the modern ocean is changing the rules. NOAA lists a familiar lineup of threats: chemical contaminants, disturbance from vessel traffic and noise, entanglement, prey limitation, and oil spills. Pressures that don't hit all populations equally, but can push vulnerable communities toward collapse. Noise is not just annoyance in the ocean, it is sensory interference. A 2021 study on endangered southern resident killer whales reported that reducing vessel noise through a voluntary ship slowdown was associated with increased foraging behavior, supporting the idea that ship noise and disturbance can measurably steal feeding time from a population that can't afford to lose it. In 2024, NOAA summarized new research showing how vessel noise can reduce foraging efficiency and success, because if your world is built out of sound, masking that sound is like fogging your eyes. Then there are toxins that don't fade just because we banned them. A major study in Science modeled the effects of PCB contamination and predicted that some killer whale populations, especially those near industrialized regions and those feeding high on the food chain, are at risk of severe decline or collapse over the coming century. Now add direct human interaction. Since 2020, a small killer whale population associated with the Iberian Peninsula has been repeatedly interacting with vessels, often damaging rudders and sometimes disabling boats. By early 2024, an international workshop report summarized that at least 673 interactions had been documented since May 2020, and noted that since 2021, these interactions had resulted in the sinking of 6 vessels. That report also warned about how people respond, because some deterrents reported in the region can be dangerous, ineffective, or even reinforcing the behavior, and the workshop recommended focusing on approaches that avoid harming the whales while keeping mariners safe. So what's happening? Even researchers are careful here, but the hypotheses themselves are revealing. The behavior may be socially learned, potentially spreading through cultural transmission in a way that looks less like a targeted assault and more like a persistent, risky game. And this is where the story becomes a collision between two kinds of power. Because an orca is not just an apex predator, it's a cultural predator. And culture can pivot faster than genetics. It can change within a generation. It can spread like a trend. Which brings us to captivity. Because captivity is what happens when we take an animal built for cultural flexibility and trap it in concrete. NOAA notes that live capture for marine parks no longer occurs in the United States, but it still remains a global threat. A peer-reviewed review in the Journal of Veterinary Behavior argued that orcas' biology and cognitive social complexity make them especially vulnerable to chronic stress in captive settings. describing mechanisms by which captivity can contribute to abnormal behavior and health problems, and concluding that orcas are poor candidates for maintenance in concrete tanks. Wild orcas are not just bodies moving through water, they are families moving through time. Strip away distance, silence, choice, and tradition, and you don't just change their habitat, you change what they are. When I started researching orcas, I expected a super predator story. Teeth, speed, clever kills. But the deeper you go, the less the story is about violence, and the more it's about something we used to reserve for ourselves. A learned way of life, dialects that persist for decades, hunting techniques that spread like apprenticeships, old females who stop reproducing and become living libraries for their families, boosting the survival of grandchildren through knowledge and support. That is not how we're taught to think about animals, and it sharpens a final, uncomfortable truth. Orca cultures are powerful and fragile because culture depends on continuity, a soundscape that lets calls travel, a prey base stable enough for traditions to remain useful, a social network intact enough for knowledge to move from elder to calf. And those are exactly the things the modern ocean is beginning to disrupt through noise, contamination, and ecological whiplash. So the title isn't exaggeration. Nothing about orcas is normal. Not their position at the top of the food web. Not the way they weaponize ice and silence. Not the way culture can divide them into worlds within a species. Not the way their minds hold memory, grief, and strategy in a medium made of sound. They are proof that intelligence doesn't have to look like ours to be real. And they are proof that the ocean still contains forms of life that can challenge our definition of what an animal is. Because when you meet an orca, truly meet it, you don't just see a hunter. You see an alternate kind of civilization. A black and white shadow carrying generations of knowledge through dark water. Thanks for coming with me into the mind of the ocean's strangest apex predator. If this film changed the way you see orcas, tap like. It tells the algorithm this kind of science storytelling matters. Subscribe if you want more documentaries where biology gets weird. And drop a comment. Which behavior felt the most impossible? The waves, the dialects, or the shark flip? And if you want another film tonight, I made one about what happens as you descend into the deep sea, where light collapses and evolution starts writing with a different alphabet. I'll see you there.